very warm welcome to all our viewers and welcome to a new edition of Africa Today, our program bringing you all the latest news happening all around the African continent. And of course, today we start with a look at news from home, where a cabinet meeting headed by the Prime Minister, Dr. Mustafa Madbouli, started at the government headquarters at the new administrative capital on Tuesday. Meeting discusses a number of political, economic and social files, as well as the latest developments on the international stage and repercussions of the Russian-Ukrainian crisis. Government initiatives and a number of measures related to increasing the involvement of the private sector in economic activities also top the agenda of the meeting. The meeting discusses laws and ministerial decisions aiming to trigger a renaissance on all levels and achieve economic and social stability. Meeting also focused on attracting investments and following up on the completion of various national projects across governorates, including the presidential initiative Decent Life, designed to develop villages and the countryside. Meeting will also aim to follow up on measures taken to implement directions of President Sisi in the fields of investment, industry, exports, monetary markets and social solidarity umbrella. Later on today, an expanded press conference is expected, so of course do stay tuned for that, as we will be continuing our coverage here on Nile TV International. And still with our news, the Egyptian Drug Authority EDA has signed a memorandum of understanding with South Africa Health Products Regulatory Authority to support collaboration between the two sides in pharmaceuticals, especially Hep C products. According to the EDA statement, the step also aims to increase the collaboration in antivirals, biological products and medical devices. We're now delighted to be joined over the telephone by our guest for the afternoon, Mr. Abdul Latif Wahba, our journalist. A very good afternoon to you, Mr. Abdul Latif. Are you with us on the line? Mr. Abdul Latif, can you hear me? Right, apologies. We have a problem with our lines. Hopefully we'll be getting Mr. Abdul Latif back on the line. Till then, we have a report coming from Libya, where hundreds of migrants left stranded in harsh conditions on the Tunisia-Libya border after fleeing violence were moved on Monday, according to an NGO. But fears remain for dozens of others forced towards Algeria. We have more details in this story.
Hundreds of migrants from sub-Saharan Africa are being transferred back to Tunisia after being pushed into a dangerous no-man's land on the Libyan border and trapped for a week there without access to basic necessities. The group was driven out earlier this month amid a spike of anti-migrant and racism-fueled tensions linked to a killing in the Tunisian port city of Sfax, a hub for traffickers organizing risky and sometimes deadly boat journeys across the Mediterranean Sea to Italy. One such boat sank on Sunday off the Tunisian coast. Coast Guard officers retrieved one body, rescued 11 people and declared 10 others missing. The fate of hundreds of migrants pushed into the Tunisian-Libyan border region drew concern from international humanitarian groups and calls for action. It also raised questions about Tunisia's migration policies. Weeks after the European Union offered Tunisia's increasingly authoritarian government $1 billion to help its slumming economy and to beef up border services to stop migrant boats from crossing to Europe.
We're now delighted to have with us over the telephone our guest, Mr. Abdul Latif Wahba, our journalist and guest for the afternoon. A very good afternoon to you, Mr. Abdul Latif.
Good afternoon, yes.
Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Abdul Latif. And of course, as we continue our coverage of the recent diplomatic activity between Egypt and many African states, of course, to face the many challenges facing the African continent, how do you see the flurry of this diplomatic activity, especially during this current challenging time?
Let us say first is that since President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi came to power, he paid a great attention to and interest for the African continent in general. As you know that Egypt during the previous decades neglected its relations with the African countries, and as you know that this is of course put some negative impact on Egypt, but during this period or the last 4 or 5 years, President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi paid a great attention for the African states.
Yes.
As you know that he adopted all the African issues, even in COP27, for example, and also in the international conferences and the conventions in the United Nations, in Europe, and so on.
Yes.
And as you know, that you remember exactly when he warned the developed countries that they must pay for or to help the African states,
yes.
especially after they colonized these countries and they exploited their natural resources and so on.
Yes.
Now it is a time for the African states to get its right from the international community as a compensation for what happened during the colonial period.
Yes.
And this is, I think, it is an important issue. And you remember exactly when President Fattah al-Sisi said that the African states or the African continent mustn't pay the bill two times.
Yes.
And now we all the international community is responsible to compensate the African countries and to help them in developing their main infrastructure and also to improve their economy in this period. As you know that the African states suffered from the lack of the main infrastructures of health services and education and so on.
Absolutely.
So Egypt affirmed many times that the African states must get their right from the international communities, especially in improving education, health services, and the main infrastructures, and at the same time to get the right of their natural resources.
Absolutely. And on top of that, of course, the new challenge related to climate change. And we've seen President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in every meeting or gathering, even on the COP27. A big focus was given to the consequences of climate change on the African continent as a whole, as it bears the most brunt as a result of climate change, even though it is one of the least contributing continents to this phenomenon.
Yeah, of course, and this is what he asserted and reiterated it during COP27, that, as you know, that the climate changes and also the superpower emissions in the world affected all the African continent and the African states. And also he mobilized the African countries to form some kind or an ally to ask the United Nations to help in overcoming the climate changes and the increase of the emissions in the world. And also, as you know, that Egypt also collected what the African financially need to face the climate changes during the coming years. And you know, President Fattah al-Sisi said that we need at least $100 billion for the African states to overcome and to face the challenges of the climate change.
Absolutely. Now, cooperation, between African countries has become pivotal, especially with regards to issues related to food security, especially after the Russian-Ukrainian crisis. How do you see collaboration in this regard, Mr. Abdel Latif?
You know that Egypt called the African states at the same time and the international community to help in providing the basic commodities and to release the basic commodities to the African states. You know that the Russian-Ukrainian crisis affected all the countries, not only in Africa but all over the world.
The world, indeed.
But they asked the international community to help to providing the main commodities, especially vegetable oils and wheat and so on, to the African states. As you know that many African countries imported and depend upon importing vegetable oils and wheat from Europe, from Russia, from Ukraine, and so on. So there are many repercussions of the Ukrainian-Russian crisis, and this is what Egypt called the African Union to face it, especially in the current time. And you know that they are. The African states are in a war against an unknown enemy. The Russian-Ukrainian war or crisis, because we don't know when it can be ended, or even to its extensions and so on. So they asked the African states to unify, to get their basic commodities and from the exporters.
Absolutely. Now, recently Egypt has played a very big role in encouraging intercontinental trade between the different African countries, and even during the presidency of the African Union by Egypt and President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, a big move happened in this regard with the trade agreement that was signed and ratified by the African nations for the free trade zone area. How important do you see this in developing economic ties between different African countries and depending more on each other as part of the African continent?
We can say that it is a tool or a way to help the African states to increase the intertrade between the African countries, especially as you know that some have, or some countries have a variety of commodities and so on. They can export it to another African countries. And at the same time, as you know, that the African continent has some economic and gathering blocks like COMESA and so on. So the cooperation is important just now to face the international threats to the African countries.
Yes.
Egypt called to increase the bilateral relations and also the intertrade between the African countries, and to depend at least on their natural resources at the same time. This is can be benefit in export and import between the African countries for both win-to-win and so on.
Absolutely right. I'd like to thank you very, very much, Mr. Abdel Latif Wahba, our journalist and our guest for this afternoon. Thank you very much, sir, for your time and your insight. And still with our news from the African continent, Human Rights Watch on Tuesday called on the International Criminal Court to investigate possible war crimes in Sudan's Darfur region, where fighting has intensified despite calls for an end to the conflict. We have the details.
The New York-based Human Rights Watch said the Rapid Support Forces RSF and allied militias summarily executed at least 28 members of the Masalit ethnic minority when they ransacked and torched much of the town of Mystiri in May. Efforts to broker an end to the violence have continued, and the East African Regional Bloc IGAD on Monday led a renewed push, calling on the warring parties to sign an unconditional ceasefire. The Sudanese army nonetheless boycotted the gathering in Addis Ababa, dampening hopes for an end to the nearly 3-month-old conflict with the RSF. Experts believe army leader Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and his former deputy RSF commander Mohammed Hamdan Daglo have opted for a war of attrition and are hoping to extract more concessions at the negotiating table. U.S. Ambassador John Godfrey, who along with other diplomats was evacuated near the start of the conflict, warned that a military victory by either of the belligerents in the Sudan conflict would entail unacceptable human cost and damage to the country. Godfrey called instead for a negotiated exit from the crisis, which he said does not and cannot mean returning to the status quo that existed before April 15. Before the conflict erupted that day, the two generals had jointly ruled the country following an October putsch that derailed Sudan's fragile transition to civilian rule. Around 3,000 people have been killed in the violence, according to the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project.
And with this final news report, we wrap up today's edition of Africa Today. We do hope you have enjoyed it, but do stay tuned for more coming your way on Nile TV International as we continue with our live coverage throughout the day of many events happening inside Egypt. You're in the company of myself, Angie Meher. Thank you for watching.